Kiddushin Daf Nun, we begin at the bottom of Daf Mem Tes, immediately following a Mishnah about where a Kiddushin took place based on false pretenses. We're going to have 5 Mishnayos on this Daf. The first 2 of them will deal with more cases of false pretenses, but the first Sugya is going to be only tangentially related, and it's going to talk about Dvarim Shabalev Einam Dvarim. If somebody thinks something in his heart that is a condition that wasn't fulfilled, can he insist on that later and say, well, this is what I was thinking, if he didn't say it? Meaning, is what you're thinking part of a deal count, or what you're thinking doesn't count as anything as Dvarim Shabalev? And then the primary sugya for the second half of the daf will be the gifts that people send after a Kiddushin. Could we have to be afraid that there's a Kiddushin involved in that as well? So if there's something wrong with the initial Kiddushin, maybe those gifts themselves are a Kiddushin. So let's begin. The Gemara quotes, the Gemara begins the sugya of Dvarim Shabalev, which are things in the heart. So we begin with a case that happened. There was a fellow who sold all his property, he sold all his land, because he intended to go to Eretz Yisrael. He didn't say anything during the deal. He didn't say that the reason he wants to sell all his land is because he's going to Eretz Yisrael. And in the end, he didn't make it to Eretz Yisrael. So now he wants his land back. He said, I only sold it on the condition I was going to go to Eretz Yisrael, and it turns out that I can't. But he hadn't said that. So Rava said it's Dvarim Shabalev, it's a condition that he kept only in his heart, and something which you keep in your heart is nothing. Dvarim Shabalev Einam Dvarim. So Gemara wants to know, where does the source for that? Where does Rava get that from? Gemara is going to try a number of different sources and finally come up with that source. And then we'll have 2 more halachos as far as similar situations if somebody sold something because he was planning to move. So our first attempt at finding a source is from 3 places where you see that you can force somebody to do something. If you can force him to do something, even though internally he's thinking he doesn't want to do it, that would seem to indicate that what he's thinking in his heart doesn't count at all. But the Gemara is going to reject all 3. Now, the first one is from the fact that you can force somebody to bring a korban oila when he's obligated to bring one as a kapara. And that's learned from the fact that the Torah uses the extra word yakriv in the pasuk describing korban oila in the beginning of Parshas Vayikra. It says yakrivenu, and later it says al pesach el moed yakriv. So the extra yakriv is to say that you can force him to bring it. Now, that doesn't mean you could just straight up force him, because it does say liritzaina. He has to be willfully, so therefore it has to be a combination of the 2. That's so you can force him until he says, I willfully want to do this. Now, he says that, but he obviously doesn't mean that, because he's only saying that because we're forcing him, so that must prove that the fact that he doesn't mean it is Dvarim Shabalev, and Dvarim Shabalev Einam Dvarim. Someone says, no, that's not a good source, because even though he may not want to, deep down he wants the kapara that he needs, and therefore there's conflicting thoughts maybe in his heart, but that ultimate thought is at the core. So the next proof the Gemara says is maybe from the fact that you can do the same thing to make a man divorce his wife. If there's a psak from the Beis Din that he's chayav to give a get, so then it says you can force him to give the get. Now there's no kapara, so you don't know that he wants to give the kapara. Someone says no, but a similar concept exists there. You have to listen to what the psak of the Beis Din is, that we paskin that you can force him to give the get. Now the same thing there applies for freeing a slave, shechuri avadim, and again the Gemara lumps that all together, that when you're forced to free him, it's not a proof of anything. It's not a proof of Dvarim Shabalev Einam Dvarim, because deep down he wants to do the right thing. So the Gemara then moves on to a different type of proof. Rabbi Yosef says it's from the fact that somebody who's Mekadesh a woman, and he says that he was only Mekadesh because he thought she was a Kohenes, a Bas Kohen, and turns out she was a Leviah, or vice versa, or she thought she was rich and she was poor, or vice versa. So there he's clearly saying that depended on this, but she's Mekadesh anyway. So, and the reason is because she didn't fool him. So he thought that, no one told him that, it's just something that he thought on his own. So again, obviously he's saying that he thought something that was under false circumstances. So it should be, there's Dvarim Shabalev. So obviously we're saying Dvarim Shabalev Einam Dvarim. So where it says, no, maybe there's just a chumrah. Like maybe we're machmir that she's Mekudeshes, but we would also be machmir that she's not Mekudeshes, but really it's a suffix either way. How do you know that we would clearly say for sure Dvarim Shabalev Einam Dvarim? So the Gemara therefore goes to our most recent Mishnah, where we had said the opposite case, where he makes a false representation to her, and we had a whole list of things that he said which weren't true. And then it says that even if at the end, there the halach is that she's not Mekudeshes, because it's under false pretenses that he said. But there it says, even if she says that I intended to be Mekudeshes, even if these things weren't true, she's not Mekudeshes anyway. So why not? She said she had in mind that she intended to. Obviously, the fact that she had in mind is Dvarim Shabalev Einam Dvarim. So the Gemara says, no, And it's not necessarily here, because here he specifically said it tonight in the Kiddushin. He said it. He said that you are Mekadeshes to me on the condition that I am a Kohen, for example. And he was not a Kohen. So even though she may say, I had in mind to be Miskadeshes, even if he was not a Kohen, but he said a Tanai otherwise, and the Tanai wasn't fulfilled, so the Kiddushin is no good. So, says Rav Chia bar Avin, there was an incident that happened by Rav Chizda, and Rav Chizda went to Rav Huna to find out, and they figured it out from the following halacha. It says if somebody says to his shliach, bring me some coins from the window or the basket, and then the shliach went and he brought him from the window, and it turns out that the window ones were hektish. So he is now sent a shliach to use hektish. We know that as far as me'ila goes, using hektish without permission is a isser, which we say that the mishalech, the sender, is responsible. He has to bring a carbon for that. So in here, this case, the guy said, what I meant for him to do was to bring me from the basket. So we say we don't care. You have to bring a carbon anyway. There's me'ila. So obviously, the fact that he says that's what he had in mind, Ram Shabbalei Veinim Dvar. So much is not necessarily. Maybe it's because we don't believe it. Maybe it's because he's just trying to get out of a carbon that he has to bring, and therefore we don't believe him when he says that. However, in our case, such as a guy who sold his property to go to Eretz Yisrael, we know that that was the truth. We saw that he was trying to do that. So how do you bring a proof from there? So the Gemara argues back, if he was just trying to get out of a carbon, he didn't have to lie and say that he meant for him to bring from the basket. He could have said for sure. He could have said that I wanted him specifically because I wanted to do Me'ila. He could have said that he was a Mazid. Mazid doesn't bring a carbon either. Someone says, no, that's not an option. He doesn't want to make him to a Russia. Someone says he could have said something else. He could have said, I remembered after I told the Shliach, and the Shliach didn't remember, in which case he's pater from Me'ila as well. Okay, the Gemara accepts that proof, and then the Gemara brings two more halachas. The Gemara says it was another incident, somebody who sold in order to go to Eretz Yisrael, and he actually went to Eretz Yisrael, but it didn't work out. He ended up having to come back. So now what? Do we say, well, he meant to go to Eretz Yisrael, and he did, and therefore the Tanai is fulfilled, even if that's what he had in mind? Do we say, no, when he meant to go to Eretz Yisrael, he meant that he should be able to stay there? So Rava says, if somebody says, I'm selling in order to go to Eretz Yisrael, he means that I'm going to be able to stay there. If he can't stay there, that's not a fulfillment. There is an Ikeda Amri, there's an opinion that says otherwise, that he said no, he wanted to go, and therefore he went, and therefore the Tanai is fulfilled, and the sale can't be reneged upon. Now, another incident is that there was a guy who sold his property in order to go to Eretz Yisrael, and he just never went. So there's two versions as to what the response is. Both sound very similar. The Gemara will explain the difference. Rav Ashi said, if he wants, he could go. The Ikeda Amri says, if he wants, he can't go. Meaning, is there something blocking him? So what's the difference between the two? So the Gemara says Rav Ashi is saying if he wants, he could go. Rav Ashi would say that even if there is something that's interfering, if he really wanted, he could get it done. But the one that says, is there something, if he wanted, he couldn't go, the Gemara is saying, was there something blocking him? There was nothing blocking him, and therefore he has no excuse. But if there would be something blocking him, this version would agree that he has a valid reason and he can cancel the sale. Okay, we get to our next Mishnah with a short comment from the Gemara on it. The Mishnah says, if somebody says to a shliach, go be Mekadesh woman for me to a certain place, and he went to his Mekadesh her somewhere else, it's possible because he only wanted it in that place. If, however, he said, if she is in this place, he's just telling you where to find her, but he doesn't care where. Now, the Gemara points out we have the same exact Mishnah by Gittin. If he said to give a get to his wife in a certain place, it's also a problem if he does it somewhere else. And the Gemara explains, why do I need to say it both by Gittin and by Kiddushin? The Gemara says there's a svara for each one, and then therefore if I would only say one, I would know the other one. The svara by Kiddushin is that he's trying to be Makar, he's trying to draw this woman close. He did not want the Kiddushin to be in a different place. He wanted it to be in a place where people will speak well of him, so that she does research, she'll hear a good report. And therefore he was makbid to be there. As far as the get, it could be that he wanted a specific place where he doesn't care to have an embarrassing event like divorcing his wife happen there. However, somewhere else he would not want to be embarrassed. And therefore, if he only said one of the get or Kiddushin, I wouldn't know the other. I wouldn't, because I would think the svara that makes sense that he would be makbid there. I would not know that the other svara works as well. Now, the next Mishnah is a repetition of a Mishnah we've seen in Ksubis, and the Gemara will explain why we need it for both of them. Let's just say the Gemara first. The Mishnah contains halachas of Kiddushin and halachas of Ksubis, which is why it's mentioned in both places. So Mishnah says as follows: if somebody's Mekadesh a woman for and he specifically says al tanai that she doesn't have any nidarim, and it turns out she has nidarim, so that's a violation of the tanai. The Kiddushin is void. If he didn't say anything and it turns out that she has nidarim, it is still grounds for him to cancel it, because he could say, I did not want to marry a woman who has nidarim, who makes a lot of nidarim, and therefore he could divorce her without having to pay the ksuba. Similar thing if she has a mum. If he made a condition that she has no mumin, then the Kiddushin is invalid if it turns out she has a mum. If he didn't make any condition, he could still divorce her without a ksuba, because he could say, I didn't want a woman with a mum. Now, a mum, which is a mum for kahanim, is a mum for women as well. As we said, the Gemara explains that we need this both in ksubas and Kiddushin for the two halachas that are here. Okay, next Mishnah. This talks about if somebody tries to be Makadesh a woman and it doesn't work, and then he sends the gifts. So, do we have to be afraid that those gifts are Kiddushin? It was custom, standard gifts that a chassan would send to the kala. So, the Mishnah brings two cases. One case is if he's Makadesh two women at once with a single pruta. It's no good because each one only gets half a pruta, and a pruta is the minimum. Or he's Makadesh one woman with half a pruta, or with anything less than a pruta. So even though we sent her gifts afterwards, she is not mekudeshes. And the reason is because we assume that the gifts were not meant to be a Kiddushin. The gifts were meant to be a follow-up on the previous Kiddushin, and therefore he didn't have in mind for a Kiddushin, and therefore there is no Kiddushin. The first Kiddushin was no good, and the second one was not l'shem Kiddushin. The Mishnah ends off, same thing is true as if the original Kiddushin was performed when he was a katan, when he was a child. It's no good because the katan can't be mekadesh. But again, any gifts that he sends afterwards is assumed not to have been l'shem Kiddushin. Now the Gemara wants to know why do you have to mention all three cases. The Gemara says you need them. The first case, he gave a pruta out, so it could be he didn't realize that it wasn't a valid Kiddushin because he's spending a pruta, so he thinks that that's good enough, and therefore it makes sense that the gifts that he sends afterwards he didn't intend to be a Kiddushin because he didn't realize this first Kiddushin was no good. However, in the second case where he only gave less than a pruta altogether, he may have realized that it's no good, and therefore we should be afraid that his gifts are l'shem Kiddushin. And if I would have only said the first two, people may not necessarily know the halachos of pruta. However, that a katan can't do Kiddushin, everybody knows, and therefore there's more of a reason to think that the gifts that he sent are meant to be Kiddushin, since he knew that the first Kiddushin was no good, and therefore you have to teach me that no, it's still, we don't assume that that was done l'shem Kiddushin. All right, now the Gemara brings another halacha, and it's going to connect it back to this. This is a halacha from Rav Huna, who says that we are choishish for savlonos. Rabbi also says choishish for savlonos. Now, what does this mean? So it means that if somebody if somebody is discussing shidduchim, meaning he has been in a conversation of a proposed marriage to a woman, but he never gave her Kiddushin. And she agreed, he agreed, she agreed, but the Kiddushin never happened yet. And then he sends her the gifts. So do you have to be assuming that that gift is l'shem Kiddushin? Because Kiddushin wasn't done yet. So Rabbah and Rav Huna said, yes, you do. We do have to be afraid that they were l'shem Kiddushin. So Rabbah asked, you could ask a kasha on us from this price over here. We said when you send the gifts, it doesn't count as Kiddushin. So Abai said, no, we said that there's a reason here. Here the reason is because he already thinks that there's a valid Kiddushin. But you're talking about a case where he has no reason to believe there's a valid Kiddushin because no Kiddushin was given at all. And therefore your halacha is right to say that if he knows there was no Kiddushin, we are afraid that the gifts count as Kiddushin. And a different version of this is that Rabbah tried to actually bring a proof from our Mishnah, and Abai asked on it. Rabbah wanted to say the proof from our Mishnah is only here in our Mishnah where there is a semblance, there's at least a bad Kiddushin that the person could think was a valid Kiddushin. So we have something to blame the gifts on. We could say he's sending gifts now because he assumed that he's Mekadesher already. However, in my case where he never sent any Kiddushin, then you could see that from the fact that our Mishnah doesn't talk about my case, that in my case where we never give Kiddushin at all, we would be chayshish that the gifts were intended for Kiddushin. So in that Abai asked, maybe not. Maybe it's actually a bigger Kiddush. Meaning in your case where there's no Kiddushin was given at all, it's pasha to the Mishnah that you would not have to be chayshish that was Kiddushin. Why? Because he hasn't even tried Kiddushin. He's not up to Kiddushin yet. They've been discussing it, but there's no Kiddushin, wasn't begun. However, in this case where he tried to give Kiddushin and it didn't work, so it's a bigger Chiddush that maybe you would think that this is another attempt at Kiddushin. Kamashman that no, we don't assume that. But really, you can't prove from the Mishnah either way because the Mishnah could be saying a bigger Chiddush. Okay, the Gemara wants to know halacha ma'aseh. What do we do? Do we assume that if someone sends Kiddushin if someone sends the gifts before Kiddushin, should we be afraid that will shame Kiddushin or not? So the Gemara answers, Rav Papa said, it depends on the minig of the place. In a place where they sometimes, or it's the custom is to send gifts before Kiddushin, then you assume that gifts are just gifts and not Kiddushin. In a place, however, where they don't send the gifts until Kiddushin is done, then you assume that these gifts must be Kiddushin. Otherwise, he wouldn't be sending them. On that, the Gemara asks, it should be obvious that in the place where they do Kiddushin first, that these must be Kiddushin. Otherwise, he wouldn't send the gifts at all. So Gemara says, no. Chiddushes were in a place where the majority of people first send Kiddushin and then they send the gifts. There is a minority that sends gifts first, so you may think we should assume that this person is from the minority. We have to be assumption that he's from the majority, and therefore this must be l'shem Kiddushin. Now, the Gemara brings a similar exchange in a different halacha. The Gemara says, Rav Acha bar Rav asked a question to Rava. If you see a woman walking around holding a ksuba, she's walking the street holding a ksuba. We don't know her as being married, but here she is, she's holding a ksuba. So, what is the halacha? So, Rava answered to Rav Acha bar Rav Huna, just because a lady's holding iksuba, that means she's an Eshes Ish. We should assume that if she receives Kiddushin from someone else, it's no good. So, the Gemara asks what happened here. What was the halacha? So, the Rav Ashi says it depends what the minig is. If it's a place where they give Kiddushin before they write the Ksuba, so then we're afraid that there was Kiddushin here. We're just not aware of it. Otherwise, why is she holding a Ksuba? If it's a place where they first write the Ksuba and then do Kiddushin, then there's no reason to be concerned. So the Gemara asks, in a place where they give Kiddushin and they write the Ksuba, for sure, obviously, it's Pashut, just like we said before. It's Pashut that she must be Kiddushin, otherwise how does she have a Ksuba? So Gemara says, no, the situation is where it was hard to find a scribe, it's hard to find a cipher who could write it, and it could be that he just chapped. There was a cipher here, he said, let's take advantage and have him write one now, even though we're not up to it yet, we didn't do Kiddushin yet, and that's why they wrote it a bit early than usual. Kamash Malan, no, we don't say that. Okay, we get to our next Mishnah. This is near the end of the daf and starts a new topic altogether. If a man is Mekadesh two women that he can't be married to, both of them, he's Mekadesh them both at the same time. Mishnah says neither Kiddushin is valid. So if somebody's Mekadesh a woman and her daughter at once, or he is Mekadesh a woman and her sister at once, that is, he says to the two of them, the two of you are Mukadeshes to me, with one speech, literally. So neither one is valid. He's not married to either of them. The Mishnah brings a story, which the Gemara will have to explain on the next daf. The story was somebody who was Mekadesh 5 women at once. 2 of them were sisters. And he did it by filling a basket of figs that were their figs, but they were Shemitah figs. He gave it to them. He said, you're all Mekudeshes with this basket. They accepted it. There was one accepted on behalf of everyone. So the Chachamim Paskin that they were all Mekudeshes except the 2 sisters are not Mekudeshes. Okay, says the Gemara, what is the source of this halacha? That neither of them are Mekudeshes. Why should I say that? So the Gemara says, maybe you'll tell me it's from the pasuk describing the Isser to marry 2 sisters, which we're assuming is talking about where he married them at the same time. What does the pasuk say? Isha lesikach litzar. A woman and her sister don't take to be tsaros, to be co-wives to each other. So you see, it says a woman and her sister meeting the same time, and it says lo yisikach. It says that the marriage is no good. So you see that the marriage is invalid, meaning for either of them. So Gemara says, if that's true, how does the pasuk continue and say that there's kares for doing that? How is there kares? He's not married to either of them. If he goes and has a beer with one of them, he's not married to her sister. So what's the problem? Obviously, it's referring to where the marriage is chal, and it must be referring, therefore, where it's one after the other and not at the same time. Says the Gemara, the source then is from Halacha Rabbah, which says anything which doesn't work one following the other doesn't work if it's done at the same time.